Thank you, everyone, for being here. I should say, when Patrick Condon suggested that I come here, what persuaded me, aside from being able to come here, was that the theme for this event was 5 crucial decades of city building, and that actually struck a chord with me, because I think there's a dividing line that we are in the middle of right now in the cities of Canada and in many other Western countries. We have just finished 5 decades in which we got lucky in terms of how we organize our cities so they can receive new people from around the world, and so on. And we are now at the beginning of 5 decades in which we will have to be skilled rather than lucky. And to understand what I mean, what I'm looking at here is the urban districts that form the bottom rung on the ladder, the places where people first arrive from other places, where they make their start in the city. This is a very large proportion of the population of Canadian cities and of many European cities and cities in the United States. And I call these districts where people first make their start in cities the arrival cities. They're cities within cities that are organized around their own internal logic to form networks of support and mutual cooperation between people who have come from the same places, often the same clusters of villages in another country, sometimes within their own country, and so on. The arrival city sometimes is a virtual place in that the people are located far apart and they help each other out. Sometimes it's a very physical place, and then it contains a very large concentration of people who come from literally the same villages. You can find blocks of South Los Angeles that are mapped to specific villages in Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras. You can find regions of North and West London that are mapped to very specific villages in Silesia and southwestern Poland. And I think to understand what I'm talking about and to get your mind around the idea of the challenges that we face in these districts, it's best to start thinking of the city not as a collection of boxes containing people, not as a collection of fixed neighborhoods and houses and communities, but of a set of trajectories. It helps to think of the life of the migrant to the city as a dotted line that exists in their mind and is very real for them, and that starts with the place they've come from, usually a village or an urban region, and extends through them to their children to a place where they expect to be. The migration experience is not one that's taken by people who failed or who are doing badly or anything like that. It's expensive, even if you're from a poor place. It's very risky, and it tends to be the most ambitious and most invested and most well-connected people, even from poor villages, who are those who migrate at all, and especially those who migrate internationally. So anybody who enters a major city in the Western world from a poor place tends to be somebody who has that dotted line in their mind, leading from their village back to the city, and keeps it with them, and it often stays with people for generations. People often continue sending money back to their villages and so on for generations. And they keep the idea that their children and grandchildren will be an established place in the urban economy and educational system and political system for generations, even if failures get in the way and obstacles get in the way. And we should understand those dotted lines and the obstacles that end up stopping those dotted lines from becoming reality as a way to understand how the bottom rung on the urban ladder functions, how it can sometimes tip into failure, and how we can turn it around into success if we apply skill and planning and design to these places. And I think, as I've said, The last 50 or 60 years have been a time when we didn't really have to think about these bottom rungs on the urban ladder, when we had the ideal places for people to arrive already existing. The next several decades are going to be a time when we're going to have to apply skill and design to these places. So this core question here is, how do people get from the mud floor to the middle class? I often ask people I run into everywhere, how long ago was your family on a mud floor? With people like me, it may have been centuries ago, but I know an awful lot of people in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal and New York and London who will say, well, my parents or my grandparents actually were on a mud floor in a village somewhere, or I was born on a mud floor in a village somewhere. The transition has happened very quickly for a few lucky people around the world. There are right now more people making that transition from the mud floor to, if not the middle class, to something more urban and more secure than there ever have been in human history. And let's look at some people like that. This is the Hu family, who I met in Sichuan, China, who live like 40% of the people around the world did 30 years ago, and only maybe 20-something% do now, on less than $1 a day. They make a bit more than that now because they have a relative who sends money from the city. That's the largest source of income in Chinese rural areas now, much larger than any agricultural production, is money sent from by relatives working industrially in the city. This is a family I met in central Maharashtra, India, who again live on that amount. India now has large numbers of people who live on that amount, but again, dwindling quickly. And on the other side of the coin, this is the Jian family in Chongqing, China, who at the point when I met them a few years ago had just bought this apartment for, they make the equivalent of about $15,000 a year, which puts them deep inside the middle class by Chinese standards. They, 20 years ago, lived just down the mud path from that first family I showed you in Sichuan. They came from the same village. And this is the Parab family in Mumbai, who I visited here. This photo was taken when they had just bought their first apartment after having lived in a slum and then something just above a slum, and having rented out all the houses they'd owned and saved for 15 years. They were able to buy a small 2-room apartment. They came from that same very subsistence level rural place in Maharashtra as the second family I showed you. It would be mythic, though, to suggest that that it's commonplace for families to make it from the mud floor to the middle class within 1 generation, typically, or even within 2 generations. But those who do, and those who strive to, do not simply get up out of the rice paddies or out of the cotton fields and wind up buying an apartment. They pass through a specific type of urban district. It is formed by people from their villages and in cooperation with each other. Often does not officially exist. The Chinese families I showed you from Sichuan, they passed through this place on the outskirts of Chongqing, which opens my book, A Rival City, called Liugongli, which was a place of about 75 people in the early 1990s, now has 200,000, none of whom officially exist, and is full of activity, industry, people arriving from villages and so on. Behind that brick wall back there is a not officially licensed factory that has about 20 computer-controlled CNC milling machines and makes motorcycle parts, and there's about 200 small businesses and sometimes quite large businesses like that inside this officially non-existent slum. This is another such district in Dhaka, Bangladesh, that has about 35,000 people in it, looks squalid and contains all sorts of metal working shops, garment mills owned by the slum dwellers, and small IT businesses and so on, as well as terrible scenes of poverty and destitution side by side. Or here in Rio de Janeiro, where you find in all these places, in all these arrival city districts, people attempting to use the resources around them, typically using ownership, not legal, but informal and well enough working, of their housing units, of their slum shacks, to generate wealth, to generate equity, and to use as collateral to borrow money, again, on the illegal informal market, in order to support small businesses and things like that. A lot of the economic logic of urban slums in the developing world is the same as the economic logic of middle-class districts in North American cities, and so on, and is not to be ignored. So that's how it works on that side of the world. The largest wave of rural to urban migration in history, and because once countries urbanize, they stay urbanized, probably the last wave of rural to urban migration of that scale in human history. By the end of this century, the other 3/4 of the world will be as urbanized as Europe and North America are now, with the two benefits that come from that: a much larger production of food, because rural areas, when they become depopulated, start producing large amounts of food, and a much smaller rate of population growth, because populations everywhere in any culture or any period of history have fewer children when they become urbanized and so on. But the road between the current reality and that better equilibrium of a more urbanized population is a difficult and painful one. We in Europe and North America went through cataclysmic scenes of violence and poverty and conflict and revolution and rioting during our period of intensive urbanization. We made all the mistakes, and part of what we should do is prevent the other 3/4 of the world from repeating our mistakes in this process. But let's look at what's happening in a larger perspective so we can understand how it affects the cities around us here. For a bigger context, let's look at the global shift going on right now. Here's a graph that shows urbanization from 10% urban to 90% urban from just the end of World War II on the left side of the graph to 50 years in the future, or 40 years in the future on the right-hand side of the graph. This is what happened to Europe, Western Europe and North America during the last 60 years or so, and is likely to happen in the future. Essentially, we were fully urbanized as far as places go at the end of the Second World War, and will continue to be. The slight uptick you see, the slight rise you see in that graph is not caused by people moving from rural areas to urban areas or ceasing to be farmers and starting to become urbanites, but is caused by urban sprawl, causing the classification of places to change from rural to urban, and so on. Not much is changing. Same within Australasia, where things are pretty much fully urban as much as they go, and will continue to be. But let's look at Latin America and South and Central America. At the end of the Second World War, about 6 out of 10 people were living as subsistence-level peasants on mud floors in South and Central America, in absolute poverty, in danger of starvation. And then in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we saw a rapid shift to urbanization, and that was the conflict over these new people in the city and their rights and their demands was responsible for the front page headlines about riots and revolutions and military dictatorships and coups that tended to occupy that region for those decades. And no coincidence that the period starting around the end of the 20th century, when most South American and Central American countries became fully urbanized and their populations reached an urban stability, was a period for most of the larger countries there of democratic stability, of increasing equality economically, of economic growth, of increasing trade relations, and so on. Same with Turkey, which basically followed that transition as well. It went from a chaotic political period during that time to a period of democratic stability and open trade and growth once it became fully urbanized. You can see the benefits of that. But more germane to us right now is what's happening in Asia and in Africa, which as a whole are now about at the point that South and Central America were at the end of the Second World War. In other words, they're in the midst of a huge shift from being a subsistence peasant-dominated rural population to being an urban population. Some countries are well advanced. China passed the 50% point at some point around 2006, 2007, 2008, depending whose numbers you believed. But other countries are further behind. Africa, Libya and South Africa are almost at European levels of urbanization now, but some countries are much further down the graph. So there's a lot of variance. But what this means is that huge numbers of people, tens of millions of people every year, are making that shift from subsistence rural life to urban life. And nobody just gets on a train or gets on a minibus and moves their family. It's usually a long process that involves one member of the family deciding to move to the city, sleep in a room with 12 other people, and make a little bit of extra income to support the family between harvest seasons, realizing that that little bit of money actually is larger than all the harvest revenue by a factor of about 20. They send another member of the family, and gradually after a few years start to realize that their family is no longer a rural family getting a bit of urban support, but is in fact an urban family that happens to have a bit of farmland somewhere. And this slow shift is happening in many, many places. It's driving the big conflicts and tensions throughout the southern and eastern hemispheres of the world, but it's also propelling much of the international migration in the world. Most of the biggest flows of international immigration in the world are from predominantly rural populations to predominantly urban areas. From largely rural areas of India and Bangladesh and so on, to the cities of the Persian Gulf and to Western European cities, from largely rural populations in Latin America to the United States, from largely rural areas of Eastern Europe and Turkey into Western Europe and so on. Most migration to the cities of the West remains a rural to urban process. Even if in countries like Canada with point systems, you have some member of the family who seems to be officially educated and middle class leading it, you still have 80% of the population who have a much tighter relationship to the village immigrating in. We still have a large amount of migration that is essentially people making a rural to urban transition at the same time as an international transition with all the culture shocks that involves, which is why the districts of cities in the West that new immigrants arrive in remain places that need to be understood as people making a foothold for a new type of urban economy that we've seen before.